Okay, let's get going. So welcome to the session. This is entitled Unpacking Responsible Research Innovation and Transformative Innovation Policy in Multilateral Research Funding. So it's a very catchy title, but it, I think, hopefully gives a sense of what we're actually interested in and what we've been doing. So we'll start just by introducing the four people that are leading the session, and then I'll give you a bit of background about what it is that we've been doing and what we like to talk about and how we'll run things. So I'm Rob Smith. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Edinburgh. I work in a field called Science and Technology Studies, which is in some ways parallel, but very closely related to a lot of the academic fields that are kind of represented in this conference, and particularly in SPRU. I work on the governance of emerging technologies, and particularly emerging biotechnologies, but have kind of quite a strong and consistent kind of thread of my work has looked at the work of research funding agencies in the governance of science and technology, which is why we're thinking about this kind of topic today. Philo, do you want to introduce yourself? And then we'll just go down the list, Ellen, Marie, and Cecilia as well.
Sure. Thank you, Rob. Yeah, my name is Filippo Cuttica, and actually my background is in design and art research, but I have kind of slowly transitioned more towards applying user-centered method and strategic foresight methods into sort of systems and transformative innovation and policy. So yeah, I've been collaborating with Rob and the rest of this crew on this project. Ellen-Marie, do you want to go first? Next.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I'm Ellen-Marie Forsberg. I'm the managing director of NORSUS, the Norwegian Institute for Sustainability Research. I also do some research work there, and I've been working on responsible research and innovation for more than a decade. I'm a philosopher and done a lot of work on ethics and emerging science and technologies.
Yes, my name is Cecilia Mattison. I'm a PhD in biochemistry in scientific background, but the last 9 years I've been working at the Research Council of Norway as a senior advisor. Since about 2016, I started to work with M.ERA-NET's funding organizations collaborating in thematic calls in Europe. Starting with EURONanomed and here with the material science research network. So I've been implementing and working with RI in these networks and also nationally at the Research Council.
That's great, thanks everyone. So if you just scroll down, Philo, to the next part. So just to give you an overview of what we're going to do in the session. So for roughly the next 80 minutes or so, I guess. This is a session that's based on some work that the four of us have been doing around a material science research program called M.ERA-NET. So this is, as Cecilia mentioned, is an ERA-NET program. This is a mechanism that some of you, it's nice to see some funders in the room, so some of you will be kind of familiar with this, some of you won't, but it's a mechanism from the European Commission, which is intended to create public-to-public connections and harmonization, I suppose, across a range of different national and regional funding associations. This program is obviously associated with, focused on material science, and one of the things that has become increasingly common, particularly since Horizon 2020, has been the requirement or desire for these programs to think about responsible research and innovation and what that might mean in the context of their programs. So although we're talking about an M.ERA-NET program, a specific program, we've all worked on a series of other programs that have had similar kinds of requirements. And so I think one of the things that we've been aware of or conscious of is that in doing this work, we often don't get the time to reflect as we're actually doing it and think about how things are going. So one of the goals of this session is really to begin to try and not create a kind of strict evaluative framework in the sense, but to create some space for us to pause, think about what we've done so far, and also draw on the experience of the rest of this community. I should say also that, so responsible research and innovation is one concept that has emerged in the past 10 years or so, I would say. It has some quite specific frameworks that have been developed. So the European Commission talks about, historically has talked about 5 or 6 keys, 5 pillars, 6 keys of open science, gender, education, ethics, etc. And EPSRC and the Norwegian Research Council have talked about an area framework. So it's more procedurally based and focuses on processes that they would like researchers or members of a science and innovation community to pursue. So they talk about anticipation, about inclusion or engagement, about reflexivity, and about responsiveness. So changing the kind of science in response to these previous processes. This is obviously one cluster, one kind of concept in a much larger cluster of concepts in science, technology, innovation. So things like anticipatory governance, reflexive governance, like buzzwords perhaps like circularity or missions that have appeared, obviously the Sustainable Development Goals, and very clearly transformative innovation policy, as many of you will know from this kind of very specific conference. So we're interested in this broader shift that's happening within research policy as well, and want to provide some time to think about what's going on there. And then finally, we obviously don't want this to just be an extractive exercise. We'd also like this to perhaps be an opportunity for you to think about your own experiences, either within this conference, we're on day 4 now, or more broadly from past activities that you've been involved in as well. And we'd like this to be kind of a candid and open session as far as it can be. I will say that at the moment this is being recorded, and so people do watch back. So while we would like you to share, obviously, only share what you're comfortable with, kind of persisting, I suppose, beyond this. And if there are things that you would like to, if after we go through this process you would rather things not be kind of shared or public, do just let us know, and we can work with the organisers to arrange that. To think about these 3 goals, we have 3 exercises, so 3 short exercises that will hopefully kind of spark some discussion. And then about halfway through the session, I'll actually talk about what we've been doing within the material science and research program that we've been working in as well. So those that can, if you can jump into Miro, I can see there are about 6 people in there already, which is great. The link is in the chat. If you can't jump into Miro, you should be able to watch along with the board that Philo is sharing on the Zoom screen. And feel free to contribute in the chat or by raising your hand on Zoom and participating in that way. So it looks like people are floating around, so just to kind of give you a very quick overview. A really helpful thing is that you can follow people, so and I can bring you all to me. So I'm going to bring you all to me now. So these are just some quick tips. So this is it's basically a big whiteboard, but it's a whiteboard that you can move around in. And we've designed a series of spaces for each of the exercises. You can zoom with your mouse. If you have a trackpad, you can zoom by just kind of pinching and moving. Then obviously there are different ways of moving around. So you can move your cursor, and if you have a mouse rather than a trackpad, you can press V on your keyboard, and that will change the way that you move. And then you can click and you can drag around the board. The tools that you can use to contribute are on the left side. So obviously this works in a kind of standard palette where you click these to use them. So, so to start with, we have kind of a very quick icebreaker, acclimatization kind of exercise. The session that we got to do is to kind of really think about the tensions that we've been facing as we've been doing this work, and think about how we might begin to kind of address some of those tensions or stay with them. It's also day 4 of the conference. So what we'd like to do to start off with is for you to just take a kind of moment and think about what aspirations or tensions that you've noticed either in your time in the conference and to date, or more broadly in your own experiences or experiments with concepts like transformative innovation policy or responsible research and innovation. I'd like you to, after you've had a quick think about that, just to paste a piece of text into a box, or if you're feeling ambitious, you can draw something or go and collect an image from the internet. You can usually just copy and paste or drag and drop into a box. I'll give everyone a couple of minutes to do that, and then we'll go around and talk through what people are putting up there. Then I'll talk about my own obtuse, mysterious images I'll start off with. And if anyone is having any issues with M.ERA, just unmute yourself and chime in, and we can help. I should say there are some Post-its to the right of this board that you can drag and drop in like this. So if you double click on them, you can just write text onto them. So. Yeah, there's always the high likelihood of chaos when you ask people to do things, right? So. Feel free to name yourself if you want, but no obligations. Somehow someone's managed to change the color of one of these boxes, which is pretty impressive. It's good, so we've got some Banksy appearing. I'll give everyone maybe 1 more minute, and then we'll hear from some of these. Okay, it looks like everyone else has either kind of stalled or is busy searching away for things. But feel free to keep adding to this space, and let's hear from some of these images. Excuse me. Maybe COVID anyway. So, shall I start with myself? Shall I start? I don't know. I'll start with myself, and then let's go across and hear from perhaps from Cecilia, from Michael, from Petra. I really want to know who Visiting Visionary is with the giant CO2 image. But so I really just wanted an opportunity to use this image because I kind of fell in love with it at some point in this when I was making these mirror boards. This is a really famous scene from Pulp Fiction, right? And part of the film is that there is this briefcase, and the briefcase is something they're all hunting for. It's supposed to have this amazing thing in it, and you never actually find out what's in the briefcase. But it's obviously eventually he kind of he does find out when he kind of eventually gets it. But as a viewer, you never see. And I feel like it's quite a good analogy for some of these policy concepts because they feel like they're things that we kind of constantly are hunting for or striving for, but actually in the generic sense they're quite hard to articulate, and they're quite hard to articulate what they might mean in practice. So one of the key tensions for us as academics, but also practitioners collaborating together in groups, is to really articulate what it is we're doing and why it's worth doing and why that's worth pursuing and what it might mean in practice. And so it's always feels like, although this is perhaps the third funding program that I've been working with, it feels kind of like starting from scratch every time. And I think that's a real tension with some of these concepts. Cecilia, I'd love to hear what you've got.
Yeah, no, I actually just put a picture I found about how nanomedicine can renew and contribute to beating COVID. And because this is how I started to really work with RRI in the way that we do and show in this this conference, and how important it is because these new approaches are with unknown effects and unknown possibilities. So
That's great. Let's hear from, I think if we just go across maybe, so who's the multitude of issues?
That's me.
Yes.
There is more text behind there too, but I can't.
Oh, really? Okay.
I think I wrote something like that. Yeah. Both transformative innovation policy and RI are. They have kind of the tension, or both a pro and a con, that they include a multitude of issues and ambitions in one overarching concept, which is, yeah, it's good in the sense that it's mobilizing a direction. On the other hand, it creates some tensions with regard to how to practically implement or how to practically work with the concepts.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to what I was saying, I suppose. Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, so I was running a session on the concept of do no significant harm, which is a principle coming through as part of the European Green Deal. And one of the conversations that was interesting to talk about and think about in that session was, what does it mean if do no significant harm is kept within the boundaries of Europe and doesn't apply to areas outside of Europe, and we're just displacing harm on a single planet. It was something that I hadn't thought about from that perspective. So I think it's a tension with these questions of responsibility.
Perfect. Flor Powell. Sorry, I can't pronounce your. I'm gonna. But if you could.
No, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yes.
Easy. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, it might be a bit different, but I recognize myself at least. So, so that's fine. Yeah, I must admit I missed a lot of the conference, so I'm not sure whether I'm on the right track. But yeah, I work for a research council, and we're really trying to to stimulate researchers to take another perspective on the research they do, and to incorporate this in their plans and their proposals. And I think what I noticed with that is that it's very hard. So I just took a picture from internet, so I'm not sure it's very appropriate. But the main thing is, I think that you ask people to take another perspective, and we have to do the same thing ourselves also as funders. And it's very hard not to fall back in your old rituals and to really consistently start to do this. And that's.
What are the things that you think you need to try and change or avoid as a funding organisation? I know that the NWO has done a lot of work in this area already.
So what we're trying to do is at different levels. We ask researchers, specifically in programs that aimed at missions. Then we ask researchers to create a theory of change for their proposal. But this also demands a lot of ourselves in terms of knowing what and also getting looking for stakeholders that enable us to make a better program, or to know what the program is aimed at. So it requires from us, I think, a similar attitude, and that's not what we are used to. We make rules, and so that's a big change also culturally, I think, within our organization, and it's uncomfortable because this requires, it takes a lot of time. You need to make space to do that, and to and from one hand, then what I also see is that we have so it's nice that you have these tools to get to grips with looking at questions from a different perspective. But then we tend to explain this model, but that's not what we ask of researchers to do. So so it's not about explaining; it's about on how do you do it, and this takes a big transition also in how we communicate, or what kind of tools we offer to. So last year we made an e-learning to help people to make a theory of change, but this is all very, I mean, it's a first step. So we're also still searching on what's necessary. So that's one reason why I joined this conference, to hear from others. Yeah.
That's great, and I think a lot of the things that you said are things that we've also felt as well when we've been working within this particular funding program, but more generally as well.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. So unfortunately, Petra is having problems connecting to Zoom. So the audio, I guess, as you can all see on the MULTILATERAL board. So we're going to be a little bit mysterious with this image, but I kind of get it. So she talks about says that kind of Banksy stands for this tension between public policy making and the real life experience of systems, and I think that's really accurate, right, as well. And it also relates to these concepts, like we talk in terms of transformations or transitions or responsibility or participation, but it's like, what does that really mean in kind of actual kind of day-to-day life? And this kind of thing came up in Michael's session as well yesterday, I think quite nicely in kind of very, very clear terms. So it's a really good point to raise. Just before we move on, I just wanted to see if anybody else that isn't on the MIRA board has anything that they'd like to add. So there's Helga and Helke and John and Renee, I think, are all in the Zoom meeting, but perhaps not in MIRA.
Oh, it's fine.
Anything?
I'm listening. It's very fine.
Yeah.
It very well matches what we are doing and what I'm doing together with Cecilia in Research Council. And we have had some contact with the Netherlands, and RRE from the Netherlands was inspiring very much our program on responsible innovation, which was kind of a twin program to the program you had in NWA. Oh, so very interesting to hear and to meet.
That's great. Thanks, Helga. Would anybody else like to add anything at this point? If not, we'll keep going. No hands, no unmuting happening, so that's okay. So for us, if I bring you all to me again. One of the most persistent tensions that we've been faced with, I think, when we've been designing and working with these kind of programs, has been the tension between the kind of more substantive, perhaps transformative, aspirational language and visions and goals of these concepts, so that really kind of talk about new funding programs, new ways of doing things, new ways of imagining futures for research, new kinds of relationships between science and society that are being kind of built through these programs, and the reality of things having to be done quite instrumentally, perhaps incrementally, that work with pre-existing programs and pre-existing patterns and structures and administrative practices, and perhaps kind of mundane practices as well, in the reality of that, and what does it actually mean to kind of work these concepts into a funding program that already exists and already has their ways of evaluating things, or their ways of communicating things. And there's a real tension there, I think, in these two aspects. There was a really nice response to that kind of problem, I think, implicitly, that was said right at the start of this conference in the plenary from Shana, who is at the South African funding agency. And I think her response was basically, you learn what the transformative programs are, and you learn where you can make a big difference, and you should just focus on those. Like, we kind of just need to ignore, not everything needs to be transformative. Let's not worry about the other stuff. And I've made similar claims. I work very closely with scientists and with synthetic biologists, and some synthetic biologists are very open to collaborating. They're very kind of up for it. They kind of want to have a bit of fun. They get what you're doing. And some of them are pretty like parochial and backwards, perhaps. And the response that I often have is just like, well, we'll just work with the ones that we like, and that's the kind of solution. And that's like a very easy way out of this, I think. But I think it doesn't really match the reality of the way that most programs work. I think there is often an aspiration within programs that exist and that are kind of well established to try and begin to think through some of these concepts. And that's what we're interested in this session. So one of the ways that I think it's helpful maybe to begin to work through some of these issues and this tension is with the idea of leverage points. So leverage points is a concept that was articulated by Donna Meadows. She's a kind of very famous systems thinker. And she identifies a hierarchy of what she called points of intervention within systems that you can begin to think with and focus on if you're trying to design transformative change or trying to develop organizational change. So these range from kind of what she, I think, would say are quite superficial things, from things like the kind of the parameters that the program works with, the loose organization of it, so how it's kind of put together in kind of quite mundane ways, and through to the kind of deeper things which are about the goals of the program, the kind of mindset, the concepts that people are thinking with, and the settings from which kind of institutional structures and norms kind of arise. So what we'd like to do with the second exercise that we've got here is to think about, ideally, what would the best points of intervention be within a multilateral funding program. So if we were going to just start from scratch and we kind of could do anything that we want, where would we choose to focus our attention on? So I'm going to give you a little bit of information about M.ERA-NET, which is a funding program, a real-life funding program. And I'm going to lay out the kind of anatomy of this program, and then ask you to identify one point that you think is the most important point to focus on if you were going to start thinking about responsible research and innovation or transformative innovation policy. So M.ERA-NET is as I've said, a multilateral materials science program. It's supported by the European Commission. There's a grant number in there, so you can look it up. It's about 50 different national funders and national and regional funders. And the first call is the largest call that they do because it's co-funded with the European Commission. And they were aiming for about €50 million disbursement. Cecilia will correct me if I'm wrong on any of these things, but and there will be annual calls. These will be much smaller, but will obviously be kind of continuous through the length of the program. It's a new program. It lasts for 5 years. It started, I think, last year, but it will run for 5 years. But it's also the third iteration of a previous material science program. So it's something which is established and kind of built up and it's got a lot of kind of standardized practices and ways of doing things, which is both good and bad. Its goals that are written and stated in the grant agreement with the European Commission are things like to establish shared visions for material science, run funding calls, evaluate projects, things like this. But then also including kind of what is now perhaps quite usual language, so trying to create two-way communication with the general public, of course questions about who the general public is, and also to raise awareness about responsible research and innovation. And like lots of programs that exist today, it's framed by rhetoric, I suppose, and language around things like the European Green Deal, around Sustainable Development Goals, around ideas of circularity and the circular economy, and around responsible research and innovation. So what I've done below is just to map out, very kind of schematically and loosely, some of the different parts of this program. So I've mapped out some processes. These are in pink. And I've mapped out the actors, so that are involved in those processes. So we can see there's a kind of a program design phase which has already happened here in the negotiation with the European Commission. And then there's an agenda setting phase which runs through to ultimately to the funding of research projects. So this goes through an annual agenda setting process, call design, application, review and evaluation, and then there's a continuous oversight and monitoring of these projects. There's another level below that, obviously, when you have research consortium. And then in parallel to this, there's a series of kind of cross-network activities and also communication and dissemination activities that are working within the program. So what I'd like to do now is just take a few minutes to think about, given this, oh, sorry, I forgot to say, there's also an evaluation of the whole program. This is interestingly right at the end of the program rather than ongoing. But so take a few minutes just to think, if you were thinking about choosing the point of intervention within this program, what's the process or the way of thinking or the group that you think that you should be focusing on? I think it's probably quite important to have some scarcity. So I think just one idea, 1 point. And if you identify a point, and then again, we'll just talk through these and think about what good ways forward might be. And if anybody would like to, of course, again, if anyone is in Zoom but not in Miro, you can see this in the shared screen and feel free to contribute in the chat. That's completely fine. Okay, I think that's probably that's the four of us, right? I think the people that are adding things. So let's go through these. Maybe if we go left to right again, and then we can maybe circle back around and see if people have comments or responses to these. So start with Michael, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I put mine where I put it in part because other people have put Post-its at places that I also find important. But I think that as much as having clear mandates and sort of evaluation-based incentives for adoption of these kinds of ideas, it's important to make sure that people have both a say in and also ability to participate in the making of their understanding about them. And having that happen at a cross-network level seems like a prudent place for it to happen, especially when policy community members and national funders are able to take that knowledge and better articulate it to people that have a role in shaping program design and the annual agenda.
If people weren't crowding around at the top, would you have gone for the top? Like, are you secretly an authoritarian, or?
I mean, I'm secretly a both and. I mean, I think if there's no valuing of the thinking differently, unless there's a specific critical mass of people that are saying we need to be thinking differently, then there needs to be some kind of these incentives. But I think that the bottom-up version is that, you know, eventually enough people demand that we think differently so that we start doing things differently as well. But until we get there.
Yeah, I understand. Perfect. So maybe Cecilia.
Yeah, I have the first note. I have the first note to the left here, upper left. I think, of course, you do talk with your colleagues, first of all, discussing about a new proposal or doing a new program, and see if they like the ideas of RI and ensure that they know what it is and so on. And then when you are at that stage that you all agree that it's important, I see that it's essential to get it into the strategic programs, because if it's not there and well understood there, it's difficult to do things on the way. Then it's much harder to get it in and to get things done. So I think it's essential to be at the strategic level very early. Then you get much more done.
So right up at the top in the program, the design of the program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's where I would go as well. Not to, perfect. So I think that maybe is Ellen Marie next. I'm not sure. Or who is you need to give with the mandate vision? Is that?
Yeah, that's me. That's right. Yeah. I mean, you have to have some sort of mandate to start even start to work, and it can come from different places. Sometimes it can come from the research councils themselves, like maybe in M.ERA-NET. That's an important part. Like in Horizon Europe, it has to also, they have to have a mandate, political mandate. So, but in any case, there must be somewhere to refer to, even to start. And I guess we have experienced that in a number of places. You know, scientists, at least in the beginning, are dragging their feet a bit, so they might need to have some signals from top, and that can be really annoying. But then my experience is that after a while they get used to it, and it's more familiar, and they also start to support the agenda when they get more used to it. So I mean, you have to work both with a scientist and but also at the very top, the kind of political level or the institutional level. But my experience is that the institutions take the lead, definitely. So.
And what are the difficulties or challenges with that kind of approach?
Well, it's it's the hard way in a sense, but there are so many strong forces that in the research communities, the whole reward system is around disciplinary work and around publication and everything. So it is I think a bit optimistic to expect that these kinds of initiatives that go beyond what they're awarded for will grow up from there. So it has to come from somewhere else, from society somehow. So
great. And Flor?
I think it's very similar what I wanted to say. I mean, this is the tool I think that works, but I'm just looking for a tool that helps you make a strategy basically, and to get a common vision of what the program aims to impact within society, and also I think who to include, or who is necessary, which parties, because that's so that's why I my second place would also be where Michael was, because that's where the interaction takes place. But of course, it's a huge investment to do this so early. Yeah. So, and that's and I think it also I think it also brings about the differences between maybe also across nations on what the problems are, or the role that these research funders have within their own national settings. But to make one step, that I think that's what I would like most. I mean, we are trying now to do it a bit later, but the earlier, the better, I guess. That's it.
Yeah, and I think and obviously this is a little bit of a conceit with this exercise, because the real answer is that you need all of these spaces in reality, right? And so, but I do think it's interesting that the majority of you have gone up there, because in other processes that we've been involved in, that's definitely the kind of starting point, right? If you don't have at least some kind of mandate or some kind of agreement that this is worth doing, then you're kind of flogging the phrase. I don't know, flogging a dead horse is an English phrase perhaps, but it's a kind of you're going down a dead end, right? It's not going to go anywhere. So and hopefully what I'll talk through will show maybe what some of the ways of actually kind of connecting these different parts up, the ways that those might work in practice. So just before we move on, does anyone have any ideas? Obviously, two of the people here have been very closely involved in M.ERA-NET, so have ideas of how to do this, and one of them has been quite closely involved. But does anyone have any ideas on the processes or the kind of way that you go about building towards those goals? I mean, is it just a case of, Cecilia mentioned kind of chats and then writing it into your proposals, but I mean, beyond that, is this kind of workshop-based things? Is it explicit frameworks that we're looking for? What are the kind of mechanisms, I suppose?
If I should try to answer that, Rob, no, I just see I just see that it has a great value if you can get into the people or the groups that actually do the writing, do the strategic work, and come with, doesn't have to be that much, but some input that could change the way things are done in later, or just at least have it on the agenda. So, because once it's there, it's about creating change and making a difference, and developing things. You know, it's kind of an open box. You can, okay, we are going to do RRI in this program, and we will develop it, and then it's kind of open. You can discuss it and create things along the way. So it doesn't have to be, you know, very detailed or very definite what you say.
Yeah, it's more about
Because
kind
it
of
is
just,
RRI.
yeah, a commitment. Sorry, perfect. Okay, so let's keep going, and I'll show what we've done. So some of the active people here know what this involves, but hopefully this will be interesting for you, Floor, and also for some of the people that are actually just listening on Zoom. So in practice, the way that M.ERA-NET has developed its work on responsible research and innovation is, I think, to develop kind of two kinds of interventions. So obviously this was decided at the program design stage by Cecilia in conversation with other research funders. So there's kind of, that conversation has already happened, and is kind of as part of the background to this. But the first one is to develop a series of guidelines, and then the second one is to, I think, focus on the annual agenda setting process that goes on alongside as part of their kind of annual activities. And there are two related activities, these two things, and there are two people that have been involved in both of these processes. So that's Ellen Marie and I. I'm only going to talk really about the guideline development process rather than the kind of agenda setting process. I think we formalized the guideline development a bit more than we did with the agenda setting workshops, but I'm happy to kind of talk about that, and I think Ellen Marie will be as well, to discuss that kind of more informally if anyone wants to talk about it. I should say that when I first started kind of thinking about this, I've always been a little bit skeptical of guidelines because they always seem quite instrumental. They're a very, very kind of soft tool. They're kind of what people think of, I think, when you say, well, so we should get some guidelines so that researchers know what to do, and then they often don't really connect to the other kind of actual parts of the program. It's often, I think, sometimes hard to see how these guidelines actually connect to the practices and processes that have been set up and that actually are kind of working within these programs. And so that's always been in the kind of the periphery, I think, of what we've been trying to achieve with the development of these guidelines, is to make these connections. And the other challenge with guidelines is that often it's possible to just throw these out into the world. So to just kind of write them and then throw them out and say, well, they're effectively rules, I suppose, or they've kind of come from some kind of central place. And so the process that we went through here was to really try and build a kind of a community space, a space across the network as a whole, across M.ERA-NET as a whole, to develop a series of recommendations for how researchers should think about concepts like responsible research and innovation, and then also how the program should begin to support those. So in autumn last year, we held a workshop with a range of researchers and funding agency representatives to think about the ideas associated with responsible research and innovation and what they might mean in practice. And we tried to balance this kind of instrumental and substantive dimension, and we also tried to focus on making sure that we actually give kind of quite specific meaning to what these ideas mean in the context of material science. because this is always a challenge with these kind of concepts. We talk in kind of very generic terms, but actually the researchers and the programs that we're working with often have kind of quite specific issues that they have to pay attention to actually give meaning to these ideas. So the goal of the workshop that we ran was really to create a kind of protected space to reflect as a community on ROI and what that might mean in the context of this field, to identify the gaps and opportunities associated with responsible research innovation, and particularly in to improve, and how that might integrate with the funding process of the program as a whole. We wanted to not necessarily design and write the guidelines bottom up, although that would have been the kind of very ambitious way of doing things, but to kind of to set a series of design criteria, if you like, or edges for us to be playing in. So to understand the design space, the things that we should definitely be staying away from, and the things that we should be working towards. And we provided a first draft of these guidelines at the very end of the workshop to get a reaction, basically, and to help concretize what those design criteria might actually look like in practice. So what I don't have in this slideshow, and I'm quite glad actually, because it's not yet a public document, are the actual guidelines. But if people are interested in hearing more or kind of seeing those, then I'm very happy to share those kind of on a one-to-one basis, and to talk about those if you contact me by email, or Cecilia by email as well. I suppose is probably a good person. Then I just want to talk a little bit about what happened in the process. So I think that what we did, and we were quite careful about doing with this workshop process, was to start from trying to create space for people associated with M.ERA-NET, not necessarily to think about ROI in the kind of very instrumental kind of bureaucratic way, but to come at it from the kind of issues and concerns associated with the field of material science. So this concept, responsible research innovation, aims to encourage anticipation, to encourage reflexivity and reflection amongst the people involved in innovation processes. And so we wanted to try and get at that by starting to develop a set of priorities of issues and concerns that were associated with this field. And it worked really nicely, because ultimately what we ended up with then was a kind of a crowdsourced, very long list of issues and topics that are associated with this field. So this ranged, it was very diverse, and it was also much more specific than we would ever have been able to produce ourselves. So it was things like sustainability, you can cut these into very kind of specific, generic terms, or kind of familiar terms. So things around sustainability and environmental sustainability in particular. Lots of questions around kind of some ethics and safety questions. Lots of questions around, particularly in the context of material science, around end use of products and supply chains, and the place of raw materials and within these research processes, which I think is really kind of gives an idea of the specificity of the issues associated with this program. But then also there were questions around democracy and the place of citizens in the development of these programs. And it was really interesting for me, at least, to see those emerge from the community that we engaged with, rather than us necessarily predefining what those were and imposing them, because I think that that's really important, which relates to the second point here, because it begins to kind of build the buy-in and the legitimacies for the work that we're doing. So I think that the process as a whole, by going through this process, firstly legitimizes the kind of issues that we now have a sense of that relate to material science, relate to the field, but also legitimizes the process of ROI. And the final point that I think is particularly interesting and useful in this kind of setting was, and unexpected for me, I suppose, is that one of the key concerns that came out of the design criteria discussion was that people would produce these guidelines and they would just create extra burden, extra admin for people to do without actually really providing any support. It was people were worried that it would be unclear how these would be evaluated, or they would have very little role in the evaluation process. People were worried that there wouldn't be expertise on the evaluation panels of the grants when people are talking, when people are reviewing these proposals. Helke is driving and trying to follow. This is kind of another one of those like consequences of online conferences. Well, it's great that you're so committed, and thank you for joining. And so what that's really helpful, because it comes. This is obviously something that we agree with as people that have been involved in developing these kind of ideas and concepts within funding programs in the past. But because that came bottom up from the community, it really gives a kind of legitimacy and a kind of I think it gives a sense of importance perhaps and momentum behind them. So we're now at a point where actually several of the funders, the lead funders within this program, are actively thinking about, well, how do we begin to actually put these kind of concepts? What do these guidelines mean for evaluation processes, for the kind of the call criteria, yeah, so that for those kind of quite bureaucratic administrative processes, I think that we may have got there, you know, with ultimately with that in terms of us, Ellen Marie, Cecilia and I sitting there saying this is something that's very important, but it actually kind of coming bottom up, I think really adds momentum to that process. So there are a lot of tensions, you know, obviously associated with these processes still. And I think that what we don't know from this process, it's an ongoing one. We don't know how researchers are going to actually act upon these issues in practice. So one of the challenges, particularly with multilateral research funding programs, is that funders have very different priorities, very different commitments, very different levels of ability in terms of what they're able to fund and not fund. And so we're yet to see what the consortia that emerge from the next funding calls are actually going to be doing in response to these guidelines. And I think that's a kind of an uncertainty for me. It's a slight, we'll see, I suppose. In the past, I've seen very kind of instrumental and shallow responses to these kind of guidelines. And I think it's a key tension with ideas like transformation, transformative innovation policy, and responsible research and innovation in general, because it points to the kind of the very, again, this pragmatic aspect versus the kind of more aspirational language that I think often sits behind some of these concepts. The other, and related to this, is that the overall goals of the program are established. So ultimately this is a material science program, and its goals and its priorities are to fund material science, while also trying to do so in a context of the Sustainable Development Goals, or do so in the context of circularity, or do so while fostering sustainability. And I think we haven't seen this yet, but what I would anticipate emerging from this are tensions in the balancing of those different priorities, because if you were to be kind of more transformative, then there are definitely certain things that you would say that we aren't going to fund, or we are going to fund. And I think this kind of more active step is something which is actually often a real difficulty and challenge with existing research funding processes and the way that processes are kind of established in them. And I also just want to say that this is a fairly foundational program in lots of ways. They're funding fairly foundational science. And so there is a very notable absence in the sense of users or publics or citizens from this conversation. The route that we've gone down is to try and build reflexivity within the community as a whole, as it exists on its own. Of course, there's an alternative way of doing that, which would be to kind of come at it from a public participation or a kind of public agenda setting process, and we've not been able to pursue that in this setting. And I think that that's important because this idea of kind of citizens setting priorities for research, for either for missions or for transformative innovation, or even in the context of responsible research innovation is really prominent and persistent. But it's something that's been kind of actually almost wholly absent from the process that we've been involved in so far. So I'm going to just pause there before moving on to the final one. I'm going to offer people the chance to respond if they would like to, or to raise any questions about process or challenges or opportunities or anything like that. And then we'll move on to the final exercise. So does anyone have any quick responses that they'd like to offer, or like me to kind of, perhaps there are ambiguities that let me to clarify?
I was wondering if you could say something about the type of gaps that turned up, or are they not? Are they very specific for this field?
The type of depth of issues. Or...
So the perceived gaps.
Yeah.
That came up in the workshop, or maybe it's a bit too detailed for now. I was wondering, so so you ask researchers to think about responsible research and innovation. So I can imagine that then that brings up different topics than they would usually have.
Yeah, completely. And so we were interested in the gaps and also the barriers, the things that created those gaps. And some of those I think are specific. It was kind of striking that, I mean, Cecilia and Ellen Marie can perhaps chime in here as well, but I think it was interesting that lots of those were kind of systemic issues that are more about research, academic culture, funding culture. So budget, like, is one thing that came up kind of very heavily. So do we have the budget to be able to do this? It's seen as a kind of a cost. A lot of these programs were seen as running on kind of quite tight budgets, and obviously there's a labor associated with people trying to put concepts like ROI into practice. So how do we make space for that? Like, is that going to be resourced? What does that come from? What does it eat into if it is going to be resourced? Okay. Questions about weighting were kind of raised. So like, where does this fit within the evaluation process? I kind of touched on that. So like, is this something which should be kind of heavily weighted and supported, or is it something which should be kind of advisory? And I think people were, the issue there is that people disagreed. So there was discussion and people were not clear about which was better or not. There were quite clear differences of opinion there. That has been solved because ultimately the funding agencies decide the answer to that question. But it's interesting that it was raised. And then I think there's another kind of gap that comes up, which is really about kind of expertise and tacit knowledge. So there's a lot of uncertainty with these kind of concepts. I think people are interested in them generally, but there's always a kind of question of putting the horse before the cart, or what comes for the chicken and the egg problem, in terms of people are interested but don't know how to actually kind of respond to these kind of issues or put them into practice. And so the only way that you can do that in this kind of program is by actually trying to put them into practice, or by collaborating with people that already have expertise in that area. But that's often social scientists or environmental scientists, and then there's often this kind of related reluctance to fund that in, or to connect to really resource that kind of collaboration. So that was the other tension that came up quite a lot. That are kind of generic issues, I think, rather than kind of specific material science ones. I don't know if Ellen Marie or Cecilia would like to add anything to that, but no.
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's good. Okay.
I think it's good.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to wrap up, we've got a little kind of futures exercise. This is a bit kind of arty and nice. So this is obviously we're in year 2 of what is a 5-year program. The plan with this is with the guidelines is to kind of trial these, to pilot them within the funding call will be announced later this year, and then to run a call and to do another learning exercise at the end of it. So this is really just the start of the work that we're doing as a group, and I think it would be really helpful for us to actually just think about, well, what would be useful for us to pay attention to, or to aim to try and to kind of work towards over the course of the program, over the coming years. And I've been quite, I think, inspired, or found a couple of papers really helpful one by Nikki Vermeulen, who's a colleague in Edinburgh, and then there's another paper which is actually a formative evaluation of transformative innovation policy that has recently just come out. So this is Ghosh et al. 2021. And so what I've done is I've just collected some of the kind of the terms that are, I suppose, common to these kind of formative evaluations, and common to kind of the circulation of ideas and the kind of the way that ideas and concepts can travel and move through research programs, and group them into 4 kind of different themes. So circulating, so how do we encourage the kind of circulation of ideas behind, so the ideas rather than the actual concepts. So how do we kind of begin to kind of build kind of momentum and capacity around these ideas? How can we encourage that? Expanding, so can we and should we expand the focus? So that at the moment the focus of these has been on these guidelines, on the agenda setting process, but can we expand our focus beyond that to other parts of the funding program? Should we do that, or should we just be focused on this kind of these specific points? Is it better to be kind of precise, I suppose, in our ambitions? What are the ways that we can kind of promote learning beyond this first session? So ideas in that kind of area would be really helpful. And then are there ways that we can kind of perhaps thicken is the word, or deepen or strengthen these approaches to governance? And if we're trying to do that, what are the kind of challenges that we should be aware of? So it would be really helpful, just I think, for the people active in MIRA, but also anyone, again, that's kind of listening in here to contribute to those ideas. And the way that I'll do that, I think, is probably to do the same as we did before. So to give everyone a few minutes to just think about those questions and jot ideas down, and then maybe we'll go around the room one final time. And of course, throw any ideas or responses that you have that don't fit into those 4 into the room. maybe to begin to wrap up this feedback. Cecilia's got two, I think. I guess if we start in the top left and then maybe work around. MULTILATERAL partnership networking. Cecilia, is that your Post-it? Do you want?
I'm ready.
Okay, go for it. Could you tell us?
I should start. Okay. Let's see. I have to move around a little bit. On the circulating part, I think at least we should do what we can to share our experiences in the platform for learning among M.ERA-NETs and partnerships. MULTILATERAL, or they have a new network coming up for partnerships. So that's a good place to be, to show. And then when it comes to learning, of course, the economy is set, the tasks are set for the network as such, but I think it still might be possible to do something in the planned workshops and meetings that are there, and to include some RRI activities in there without it being huge, but at least something that could contribute to learning among projects and so on. That's
So to use the kind of cross network.
Yes.
Spaces, yeah.
Cross
Well,
network, yes.
Biotech did a little bit as well, yeah. Is the MULTILATERAL partnership because there was one, is it just finished and then so there's a new one that's just starting?
I'm not sure about the details, but I think they just applied for a new network that will be a learning network for the partnerships, all the partnerships coming up in Horizon.
Yeah, that would be a really good thing to do, to be involved in that. So
yeah, maybe
somehow. I'm going to just take mine. So it maybe relates actually to what you're saying in the learning part, but just the expanding. I think obviously this is always a resource question, and like you have to pick your battles in a way, and I think there's a lot to be said by just working out how the funding parts kind of work and the agenda setting, the parts that were already in work, and kind of focusing on those. But again, I think like the kind of more outward facing parts of the program, it's kind of would be important or useful to try and have a presence in some of those, if we have the time or the resources, which kind of relates to what you mentioned in the learning section, Cecilia. So go Ellen Marie, you're the massive, I think you're the massive one in the middle, right?
Yeah, I couldn't choose one of the four, so I had to put it in the middle. So I think there should be a learning arena in M.ERA-NET engaging with funded projects, and there will be some sort of cross-project activities anyway. So I think so. Then we could kind of attach that to other activities that are already planned, and also once we get more. Once we get the proposals in and we get actual projects starting up, we should collect good examples, because we were looking for that, and that would be very much appreciated, I think, among the materials researchers, because it remains abstract to them. So collect and communicate good examples of how materials projects treat the RI. And of course, to choose those that take a more deeply embedded approach, which we, recommend. There will for sure be differences in how deeply embedded RI will be. So, but we can choose some examples. and also maybe related to the different areas, because it's a very broad area, material science in general. So, and just thought we could have a prize for the best ROI among our M.ERA-NET projects to just increase the visibility of the topic. This doesn't really have to take much budget. It's just it's just a nice thing. We can't do it yet because we don't have enough examples, but maybe in a bit more than a year, maybe like 2023, we could do it. It wouldn't be so hard. It would be
to support it, to incentivize, and make things more prominent.
You are touching upon, I think, one of the things that we really asked for in our workshop, to have the good examples and to make them visible, and and a prize could be to go. Well, now we can't travel these days, but when you can travel again, to go to a conference and have that one for free, the travel and the conference. It's not that expensive, and you could collaborate with some to manage that.
Absolutely, and I mean, it doesn't really have to be a prize. It can just be, this nice thing on the website, and just glory. But it could be both.
So we have 2 minutes left, and we have 2 points from Flor, I think. So maybe if you
very quickly.
Share those. And then,
Well, I was just see how can you follow up on what you already did, I think, and there are 2 components. One is basically just reflection on how it works in practice, and with the community you already did it with, and maybe adding the component of the public, and see where the differences are in terms of learning. I think that would be simple.
Yeah, is it possible to kind of expand slowly, maybe just kind of in the steps, like expand the people that are reviewing or looking at those guidelines, or that work? Yeah, maybe that's a way of doing it kind of gradually to kind of.
Now, of course, I haven't seen the guidelines, so it's hard for me to translate what they really mean, but and how much they translate to something that exactly what you were talking about with the examples. I mean, people have to make a translation to their own work and their own way of, and that's what you need. So to follow up on what you started, I think, to internalize things more makes sense to me.
Yeah, and that's great, and I think that is part of the plan as well. So it's perfect. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you in particular for joining. It's been really good to have you kind of actively participating, and Helga listening. And thanks to everybody else that's been following along and that watches this back in the future. I'm just going to paste my Edinburgh University page in so that people can find me, because I have the most common name in English. And I'm also going to put Ellen Marie's in, even though that she's generally, I think, much more findable. So people in the chat, those are 2 links to follow. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Cool.
Thanks a lot, Rob.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.